March 3, 1943. The Bismarck Sea, 200 meters northeast of Lae, New Guinea. Commander Shigeru Sugawara stood on the bridge of the Japanese transport ship Shina Maru, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The morning air was thick with tension. For the past 2 days, his convoy had endured repeated air raids, and yet, miraculously, most of the bombs had missed. Still, Sugawara felt the weight of a growing unease pressing on his chest. He could feel it, something was coming. His ship, a vital lifeline carrying 600 soldiers, was heading towards Lae, carrying reinforcements desperately needed to defend against the Allied advance. The convoy, he believed, had survived the worst. But the voices of the lookouts soon pierced the calm of the morning. Aircraft approaching low altitude, bearing 040. Sugawara's heart skipped a beat. Low altitude? That was unusual. As his trained eyes scanned the skies, what he saw was beyond comprehension. Twin-engine bombers, the infamous American B-25 Mitchells, were coming at full speed, not from high above, but skimming the waves, flying at such a low altitude that the propellers were almost touching the sea. The aircraft were traveling faster than anything Sugawara had seen, 250 miles per hour, and closing the distance far too quickly. There was no time to think, no time to react. A chilling realization settled over him. He had just 40 seconds. 40 seconds before everything he knew about naval warfare would be turned upside down. In those brief moments, Sugawara's mind raced. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding what was happening, grasping the unthinkable. This wasn't the high-altitude bombing that he and his officers had trained for, where a ship could maneuver and evade, giving them precious seconds to change course and avoid a hit. This was something else. The speed of the bombers, their low approach, the almost instant danger they posed, all of it, was something the Japanese Navy was not prepared for. Sugawara and his crew watched in horror as the first B-25's nose erupted in a shower of fire from its machine guns. Heavy bursts of bullets rained down, ripping apart his forward gun crew before they could even react. Glass shattered around him as the bullets tore through the bridge, and his fellow officers were mowed down. Blood stained the crisp white uniforms as Sugawara instinctively ducked for cover. And then, the moment that would haunt the survivors for decades, the bombers released their payload, not falling, but skipping across the surface of the water, like a stone tossed by a child over a pond. Sugawara had no time to process what was happening. The 500-pound bomb hit the Shina Maru's hull below the waterline with a deafening roar, followed by the thunderous shock of the explosion. The blast, magnified by the pressure of the water, tore a 20-foot hole in the ship's side. Water flooded into the engine room, and within moments the ship began to list. The crew had been blindsided, caught in a storm of violence they couldn't escape. It was over in less than 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, Sugawara's world had gone from an operational transport vessel, brimming with hope for reinforcements, to a sinking coffin. The Shina Maru, along with the rest of the convoy, was doomed. As the bombers continued their relentless assault, Sugawara could only watch in disbelief. What had started as a confident mission to bolster Japan's defense was now a battle for survival against an unimaginable new tactic. The lesson was clear. The rules of war had changed, and the Japanese Navy was no longer in control. The year 1942 was a dark one for the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur had fled the Philippines, and much of the U.S. Air Force in the region had been decimated in the opening months of the war. By the middle of 1942, American forces were struggling to regain ground against the formidable Japanese fleet. The tide of the war seemed to be firmly against them. But in the face of overwhelming adversity, the American forces were about to discover a new, revolutionary tactic that would forever alter the course of naval warfare. Enter General George Kenney, a grizzled World War I fighter pilot who had been assigned to oversee the Southwestern Pacific Air Forces. As MacArthur's new air commander, Kenney inherited an air force on the brink of collapse. Most of the aircraft had either been destroyed on the ground or were too outdated to be of much use. High-altitude bombing, the standard method for most of the war, had proven to be ineffective against Japanese convoys. Ships could scatter, change course, and evade bombs from high altitudes. In short, the method wasn't working, and losses were mounting. Kenney understood that if they were going to stop the Japanese convoys from resupplying their forces, they had to come up with something entirely different. He believed that traditional tactics needed to be abandoned. Bombers needed to get closer, much closer. The idea of skip bombing had been experimented with by the British Royal Air Force. The concept was deceptively simple. Approach the target at a very low altitude, ideally no more than 200 feet above the water, and release bombs with a delayed fuse. The bombs would skip across the surface of the water like stones, striking the ship's hull below the waterline, where they would explode with devastating force, magnified by the pressure of the water. However, there was a massive obstacle. The low altitude would expose bombers to devastating anti-aircraft fire from Japanese warships and transports, which bristled with machine guns and cannons. The tactic had been deemed effective in theory but suicidal in practice. Kenny needed someone bold enough to make it work. That person came in the form of Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Pappy Gunn, a former enlisted Navy pilot, had already made a name for himself by defying convention. He had a reputation for making things work when others said they couldn't. As an aviator, he'd always been a bit of a maverick, willing to challenge the norms and take risks others wouldn't even consider. But it was in the direst moments of the war that Gunn's innovative thinking would shine through. He had a vision. If skip bombing was going to work, the bombers would need to be armed to the teeth to suppress the enemy's fire. He proposed modifying existing bombers, particularly the Douglas A-20 Havoc, by replacing the nose with a solid metal housing to accommodate multiple heavy machine guns. The idea was simple. Instead of relying solely on bombs, these bombers would also use intense forward firepower to neutralize the ship's defenses before the bombs were released. It seemed like madness. Adding extra guns to an already fragile bomber would alter the aircraft's balance and slow it down. Yet, Gunn was undeterred. In the face of skepticism from engineers and Air Force experts, he pushed ahead with the plan, determined to prove that the concept could work. By the end of 1942, the first modified bombers were ready for combat. The B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber with the right combination of speed, payload, and maneuverability, would be the ideal platform for this new tactic. These modified B-25 seconds, armed with up to 8 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, became the first true strafer bombers. They were fast, heavily armed, and able to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dared to challenge them. In early 1943, the B-25 strafer was unleashed upon Japanese convoys, and the results were nothing short of catastrophic for the enemy. March 3, 1943. The skies over the Bismarck Sea would soon become the theater of one of the most shocking and decisive airstrikes of the Pacific War. In the early morning light, the Japanese convoy, unaware of the approaching danger, continued its slow march toward Leh. The convoy, led by Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, was transporting over 6,000 troops along with essential supplies. Their mission was vital, the reinforcement of the Japanese garrison in New Guinea. But as the convoy neared its destination, the lives of those aboard the transport ships were about to be changed forever by a new kind of warfare. The sun had barely risen when the American bombers, led by Major Ed Lana, appeared on the horizon. 12 B-25 Mitchell bombers, in their new strafer configuration, swooped down at a terrifyingly low altitude, skimming the waves at over 250 miles per hour. Accompanied by A-20 Havoc gunships and P-38 Lightning fighters, these bombers were flying faster, lower, and more powerfully than anything the Japanese could have anticipated. The Japanese fleet was scattered and disorganized after previous high-altitude bombings had forced them to change their formation. They had expected more of the same, the usual high-altitude raids where bombs took 30 seconds or more to fall, giving them time to maneuver and avoid a hit. But this was something entirely different. The B-25 seconds arrived with a speed and ferocity that left no time for the Japanese defenders to react. The moment was almost surreal. The first B-25 seconds swooped in so low that the ships appeared to grow larger in the windscreen, almost as if they were coming at the ships from below the horizon. The Japanese gunners, already rattled from the earlier waves of attacks, had no time to adjust their aim. As the bombers approached, the 40-second window of defense that the Japanese fleet typically had in a high-altitude attack was reduced to nothing. In those 40 seconds, the skies became a storm of lead and fire. The B-25 seconds opened fire with their 850 caliber machine guns blazing. The first wave of strafing runs targeted the ship's anti-aircraft gunners, tearing apart gun crews before they could react. The sheer volume of firepower coming from the B-25 seconds was overwhelming. Japanese sailors, standing on deck, were shredded in seconds, their bodies torn apart by the relentless barrage. Officers on the bridges of their ships, trying to give orders and issue evasive commands, were gunned down before they could even react. And then the bombs came. The B-25 crews released their 500-pound bombs at point-blank range, allowing them to skip across the water like stones. The physics behind the skip bombing tactic were brutal in their simplicity. The bombs didn't fall like traditional bombs. Instead, they retained the aircraft's forward momentum, striking the ship's hulls just below the waterline. The delayed action fuses allowed the bombs to sink into the ship's belly before detonating. The resulting explosions were devastating, magnified by the immense pressure of the water. The Shina Maru, the ship led by Commander Sugawara, was struck by 3 of these deadly skip bombs in less than 30 seconds. The ship, once a proud transport vessel, began to sink immediately. Water rushed into the engine room, flooding the compartments with a force so powerful that the ship began to list. Within 8 minutes of the first bomb's impact, the Shina Maru was lying on her side, half submerged. Hundreds of soldiers, who had been below deck, drowned as their ship capsized. They had no chance to escape. The same fate befell the other transports in the convoy. 4 Japanese destroyers, caught in the maelstrom of strafing and bomb blasts, were also sunk or severely damaged. As the bombers made their runs, the skies erupted with the sound of gunfire and explosions, the scene painted with smoke and the cries of men in their final moments. Within hours, the convoy that had set out with hope of reinforcements was obliterated. By the time the skies cleared, more than 2,800 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a stunning, one-sided victory for the Allies, one that would have lasting implications on Japanese naval strategy and morale. For the Americans, this battle would be remembered as a triumph not only of firepower but also of innovation. The skip bombing tactic had proven to be nearly impossible for the Japanese to defend against. In those precious 40 seconds, the fate of an entire convoy had been sealed. What had once seemed like a traditional air raid had turned into a deadly, rapid-fire storm that annihilated an entire fleet. The devastation of the Battle of Bismarck Sea left the Japanese fleet reeling. In a matter of hours, an entire convoy, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers, was obliterated. 8 transport ships, along with 4 destroyers, were either sunk or crippled, and nearly 3,000 men were lost. For the survivors, the physical and emotional scars would endure far longer than the wreckage on the ocean floor. But the true tragedy of the Battle of Bismarck Sea was not just the staggering loss of life and ships. It was the profound psychological toll it took on the Japanese military, shattering long-held beliefs about naval warfare and the invincibility of their fleet. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had been grounded in the belief that ships could evade aerial bombardment through maneuvering and defensive fire. The high-altitude bombing tactics, with their 30-second fall time, gave captains precious moments to steer their vessels away from danger. The risk of a successful attack was low, and the loss of ships during air raids was considered an acceptable risk in the greater strategy of maintaining supply lines to reinforce garrisons in far-off territories. But the events of March 3, 1943, shattered these assumptions. The B-25 bombers, equipped with their devastating skip bombs and strafing fire, had broken the paradigm. The Japanese fleet, which had long relied on their anti-aircraft defenses, was caught entirely off guard. Ships were not only hit directly by bombs but were exposed to such overwhelming gunfire that defensive efforts were neutralized before they could even begin. For Japanese commanders, this was not just a tactical defeat, it was a complete strategic disaster. Admiral Kimura, who had led the convoy, was left with the grim task of reporting to Tokyo about the annihilation of his fleet. His after-action report was filled with a sense of disbelief. The Japanese Navy's failure to understand the new, brutal tactics employed by the Americans was a bitter pill to swallow. The attackers had come at them in a way they had never anticipated, and in doing so, had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. The psychological effect on the surviving sailors was profound. They had always believed that their navy could withstand air attacks. Now, that confidence was shattered. Survivors from the sunken ships would later recount how the 40-second window of warning felt like an eternity. Those precious seconds were enough to instill panic, as they realized that there was no time to maneuver, no time to fight back effectively. The terror of watching an enemy bomber's guns open fire, only to see their comrades fall before they could even react, left deep psychological wounds. The loss wasn't just tactical, it was deeply cultural. For a military that had prided itself on honor, duty, and the invulnerability of its fleet, the battle was a stark reminder that no matter how brave or determined they were, they could be undone in a matter of seconds by a force they could not fight. The strategic shift was immediate. No longer could Japanese commanders afford to rely on large-scale surface convoys in contested waters. The era of amphibious reinforcement was over. From that point forward, Japan turned to submarines and smaller barges, operating primarily at night to avoid detection. The shift was a desperate attempt to maintain supply lines, but it also demonstrated a profound loss of confidence in the naval tactics that had once been their strength. The once dominant Japanese naval power, which had commanded respect and fear across the Pacific, had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. The battle's effects went far beyond the immediate losses at sea. The psychological trauma reverberated through the Japanese forces for the remainder of the war. Survivors of the battle would later admit that every time they heard the sound of low-flying aircraft, they would be flooded with fear and panic. The memories of the bombers' strafing runs and the rapid destruction of their convoy would haunt them. Many would refuse to take up positions on deck, preferring to stay below, away from the open air where they had seen their comrades die. This shift in morale, this profound psychological impact, would have far-reaching consequences as Japan continued its struggle in the Pacific. For the Allies, however, the Battle of Bismarck Sea became a turning point. The successful use of skip bombing was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. The Japanese Navy had been forced to confront the fact that the rules of war had changed, and for the Allies, it was proof that innovation, courage, and persistence could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The Battle of Bismarck Sea was more than just a strategic victory for the Allies. It was a demonstration of how innovation could dramatically alter the course of a conflict. The new tactics of skip bombing, which had been introduced just months earlier, proved to be so effective that they not only decimated a Japanese convoy, but also became a cornerstone of Allied air operations throughout the Pacific. The skip bombing technique, developed through desperation and experimentation, had been a breakthrough in military tactics. Unlike high-altitude bombing, which had limited success against the maneuvering Japanese fleet, skip bombing allowed bombers to approach at terrifyingly low altitudes. The bombs, rather than falling from a great height, skipped across the water like stones, striking ships below the waterline where they were most vulnerable. The result was devastating. Water pressure magnified the explosion's force, tearing holes in the hulls of ships, causing catastrophic flooding, and leaving little time for the crew to react. This innovation, pioneered by Paul "Pappy" Gunn, would go on to define the future of naval air combat. The B-25 strafer bombers, now armed with a deadly array of 50-caliber machine guns in their noses, provided the cover and firepower needed to suppress the enemy's defenses before the bombers made their attack. Gunn's daring idea, though initially met with skepticism, was proven in combat. In the Bismarck Sea, the success of skip bombing marked the beginning of a new era of close air support and anti-shipping warfare. The impact of this innovation was felt immediately. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. Air Force had modified hundreds of B-25 seconds to take part in similar strikes, using the same tactics to destroy Japanese ships and convoys throughout the Pacific. The lessons learned in the Battle of Bismarck Sea were quickly adopted by other Allied air forces, and the fearsome reputation of the B-25 strafers grew. These bombers, which had once been viewed as standard medium bombers, were now seen as the ultimate tool for striking fear into the hearts of Japanese sailors. For the Japanese, however, the legacy of the Battle of Bismarck Sea was one of horror and devastation. The loss of an entire convoy, the deaths of thousands of soldiers and sailors, and the psychological trauma of being caught by surprise at wave-top height shattered their confidence in their naval superiority. From that moment on, every Japanese ship that sailed through contested waters would do so with a newfound sense of vulnerability. Their once strong belief that they could defend against air attacks with evasive maneuvers and gunfire was irrevocably broken. The Battle of Bismarck Sea also marked a turning point in the broader strategy of the Pacific War. No longer could Japan rely on large convoys to transport troops and supplies to its far-flung islands. Instead, they would be forced to rely on submarines and small, inconspicuous barges, moving at night to avoid detection. This shift, born from the lessons of the Bismarck Sea, would profoundly impact Japan's ability to wage war in the Pacific, as Allied forces increasingly gained control of the skies and seas. Beyond the immediate tactical success, the legacy of skip bombing continues to resonate in modern military strategy. The principle behind skip bombing overwhelming enemy defenses with concentrated firepower and then delivering a devastating attack with precision became a central tenet of close air support doctrine. Today, modern attack helicopters like the AH-64 Apache employ the same philosophy, using cannons and machine guns to suppress defensive fire before launching precision-guided missiles to strike enemy targets. The battle also served as a reminder of the importance of adaptability and innovation in warfare. The success of skip bombing wasn't just about having the right weaponry, it was about the willingness to challenge existing doctrines and the courage to try something new. Pappy Gunn's persistence in the face of doubt, the resourcefulness of the engineers who modified the bombers, and the bravery of the air crews who risked their lives to test these tactics in combat all contributed to the success of this game-changing approach. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the Battle of Bismarck Sea was the human cost of war. The soldiers and sailors who fought and died that day, both American and Japan's, paid a heavy price for their nation's military strategies. While the battle demonstrated the power of innovation and the devastating potential of air superiority, it also highlighted the immense sacrifices made by those caught in the path of war. Their stories, their courage, and their suffering serve as a reminder of the true cost of conflict. In the years following the war, the legacy of the Battle of Bismarck Sea was enshrined in the memories of those who survived. The skip bombing tactics developed during that battle would continue to shape military strategy for decades. The lessons learned in the skies over the Bismarck Sea, where 40 seconds of terror and devastation changed the fate of an entire convoy, would be remembered as one of the most significant moments in the history of World War II. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to share it with your friends and family. Help spread the courage and sacrifice of those who shaped history. And if you want to hear more incredible stories from World War II, be sure to subscribe to wwii Courage. Stay tuned for more tales of bravery, innovation, and the untold stories that defined the greatest conflict in history. Subscribe now and join us on this journey.